Welcome to the Holy Post. The Satanic Temple has been allowed to erect a temporary display in the Iowa state capitol, provoking some to double down on their commitment to Christian nationalism, and others to rethink the scope of religious liberty altogether. Then Kaitlyn responds to an article accusing her and other authors of promoting a loser mindset among Christians. And are Phil and I conspiring with a God-hating Hollywood producer to destroy the church? Then how do we deal with the unique pain caused by bad church experiences? Bishop Todd Hunter discusses his new book, What Jesus Intended: Finding True Faith in the Rubble of Bad Religion. Todd Hunter's book is also our selection for this quarter's Holy Post Book Club, which is available exclusively for Holy Post Plus subscribers. And we have a new episode of Getting Schooled by Kaitlyn Chess about matchmaking. Is it appropriate for a church community to set up singles? Kaitlyn says it depends. She talks about how to do it and how not to do it in this week's episode. That's just some of what you'll get as a Holy Post Plus subscriber, and right now we're offering a special year-end discount for new subscribers. So go to holypost.com to learn more. Here is episode 595.
Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I'm here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, Phil.
Hi. You knew I was going to say that, right? Why the delay?
What delay? There's no delay.
Oh, okay. All right. It took you a while to respond.
It was
And Kaitlyn
enthusiastic.
Shess. Hi, Kaitlyn Shess.
Hi,
Yeah,
Phil.
there's more enthusiasm than usual.
Than normal, yeah, that's what I noticed.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that level. I don't know. How many levels of perky are there on the perky scale? If
I
you
don't
go...
know.
Yeah, if you go from Stephen Wright, the stand-up comedian, to say that's 0, and on the other end is the guy who, the exercise guru, the little short guy in the tight shorts who's on
with
David
the
Letterman
hair.
all the time. Yeah, with the fuzzy hair.
Richard Simmons?
Yes. Yeah, so Richard Simmons is 100 on perky, and Stephen Wright is 0 on perky. And Skye is usually about a 10 on perky.
Oh, that is so
But
unfair.
I
Here's the
think
difference.
You may have peaked at about 20 just there.
Yeah,
you
that
hit
was
20
an
on the
increase.
perky scale.
I think maybe last time we recorded, it had just been gray and gloomy for days and days and days. And I can handle cold, I can handle all that. But when it's just gray forever, I think it's seasonal disorder, whatever that's called. And now it's bright and sunny, even though it's cold out. It's sunny and I feel alive, and I've got my vitamin D or whatever that is that I get from sunlight.
You know, Skye, we're putting on a show. We have to show up for our audience because they might be feeling gray and gloomy in the gray and gloomy weather, and we don't want to add to that. So we need to be perky, even if we don't feel like it on the inside. It's called
Phil,
called acting.
Whoa.
You should teach at a seminary, Phil.
No.
Okay, you're not. Oh, they don't like that idea. Okay. Do you really want me to show up every week exactly how I feel on the inside?
I didn't say that either.
Yeah, there's a range
Fine.
there.
Fine.
Yeah, that's right.
Time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Kaitlyn. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. Sometimes life feels like I'm lugging around a 1,000-pound backpack full of yuck. Sure, I can unload all my struggles on my friends or my spouse or my dog, but often it's more productive to sit down with a trained therapist. Therapy is expensive, though, and finding a therapist who shares your faith convictions is hard. That's where Faithful Counseling can help. With more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, Faithful Counseling will pair you with someone who can help. More affordable than traditional counseling and more flexible, too. You can request a different therapist at any time. What have you got to lose? except that big weight on your shoulders. We all need to talk to someone sometime, and Faithful Counseling can help. So keep growing into the best version of you. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional faith-based counseling that you need. They've even got a special offer for our listeners. Right now you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode. Okay, Kaitlyn, are you, because you seem, you're probably a 50 on the perky scale.
Thank
pretty
you.
reliably.
Yeah.
So, and is that natural? Is that your natural level that you
I'm
approach
pretty
the
happy.
world with?
I'm a pretty happy person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
When I get to see
Like-
you guys, it makes me so happy.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't work with Skye.
Yeah,
I'm
he's
not
not
sure
happy
why.
to
He
see
gets
us.
to see us, and he's like,
I am.
Not
And we're all
feeling
going to hopefully be in person tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're doing. What's going on, Skye? Tell us about it.
Well, on Wednesday, we're recording a Holy Post live event here in Wheaton. So Kaitlyn's coming into town for that. And we will have a special guest and lots of people. And while Kaitlyn's in town, we're going to get together for a dinner and do some planning retreat stuff and other things.
Oh, my
so
goodness.
we'll actually be physically present, not just
What
on
a week.
camera.
This is like a gold
Wild.
star week.
Yeah.
This is woof. This is really okay. That's great. Over the weekend, when did it start? We have to talk about this. So Rob Reiner dropped something on his Twitter feed that ended up blowing back on me. Isn't that funny? Isn't that a funny world? Wouldn't you say that's a funny world, Kaitlyn? How did that happen?
I mean, yeah, it is a funny world.
Yeah, how did that happen? Well, let me tell you. There's a new documentary coming out, a feature-length documentary that I believe is actually going to be in theaters, although probably not very many. I don't know how many theaters really want to show a documentary about Christian nationalism. It's called God and Country. It's an analysis of the rise of Christian nationalism. And they interview a bunch of talking heads, including Skye Jitani, who no one seems to mind. No one seems to mind when Skye Jitani shows up someplace. Controversial.
I got
Did you get some blowback?
stuff thrown. Yeah,
Who
I
got
did, quite a
into
bit.
it, though,
Although,
Phil?
yeah, I didn't respond to any of it.
Oh.
I responded to none of it. Zero.
Okay. So, So, people didn't like the trailer, first of all. Well, some people who are, kind of pro-Christian nationalist didn't like the trailer because it was obviously not so excited about Christian nationalism. But then, because it was from Rob Reiner, who is an atheist, he's a progressive, he's liberal, he was friends with Norman Lear, who died last week, who started the People for the Separation of Church and State, or whatever the organization is that Norman Lear started. So here's the deal. Rob Reiner is an anti-Christian atheist. And yet, you, Skye Jitani, and you, Phil Vischer, and Kristen Dumais, and Jamar Tisby, and David French, and Russell Moore is kind of the usual cast of characters. And then people like Dr. William Barber and some others that aren't really in our evangelical tent, all got called out for partnering with an anti-Christian atheist to attack the church. Mm-hmm. Skye, how do you respond? Guilty as charged?
Not guilty. Not
guilty.
Not because, number one, I would argue I am not attacking the church. I am seeking to help the church free itself from its captivity to a heresy. That's number one. But number two, people clearly did not understand what an executive producer does. And I think you tweeted out that most of us were unaware that Rob Reiner was even connected to this project when we originally agreed to be interviewed for it.
Yeah.
So
Just true.
that was interesting. It's a classic guilt by association kind of tactic.
Yeah. Lots of people tweeted lots of things. One conservative commentator tweeted, "Why does a Jewish agnostic Hollywood elitist care about Western Christianity in middle southern USA? Seems like maybe you hate Christians." Do we think this means that he hates Christians?
No, I think he's concerned about the country that we all share. And when Christian nationalists are storming the Capitol on January 6th, trying to overturn an election, that's something that should concern everybody, regardless of your religious identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So should we, because our friend John Fia got into it over at Messiah College and did raise the issue, should they have known who they were in partnership with before they agreed to do this? And mentioned that he prefers working with Christian publishers rather than secular publishers because I didn't quite follow the logic entirely, because then Kristen Dumais kind of got into it with him and said, hey, I've had great experiences with my secular publishers with my books. So did you read any of John Fia's stuff?
I did, and I haven't responded to that either, but here's the dilemma.
Yeah.
How far removed do you have to be in order to not be suspect? And here's why I bring it up. Years and years and years ago, somebody pointed out that Zondervan, who's a very large Christian publisher, which also merged with Thomas Nelson, another big Christian publisher. I have done books with both of those houses. Both of those companies are now owned by HarperCollins. HarperCollins is owned by News Corp, which also owns the publishing imprint that prints the Satanic Bible. So if you are a Christian author that has done any work with Zondervan or Thomas Nelson, or if you own an NIV version of the Bible, which is published by Zondervan, then by only a few degrees of separation, you are endorsing the Satanic Bible because it's connected to a corporation that publishes both of those products. Like, how far removed do you have to be before you're not guilty by association? I think that logic is
a little
insane.
Farther than you are from the project that I don't like.
Exactly.
I think
that's what it comes down. And there is no way to extricate yourself from a globalized network of consumerism and capital that is all over like everything is connected to everything else in some way. Forget Kevin Bacon. We all have 6 degrees of, atheist Christian haters in some way, I guess is the way to put it. Like it's unavoidable. And so if you want to dismiss somebody's point of view, you can do so by just making them guilty by association in some way. And then we don't have to listen to them.
Here's my only point of questioning about that, and I'd love to hear Kaitlyn's opinion on this too. Say you are a liberal progressive who has some concerns about the Clinton family, okay? Just the Clinton dynasty and some things they did, and you get approached, would you like to be in our documentary about the Clinton family? And you say, oh yeah, I'm an expert on this aspect of the Clinton family, so I'll sit for an interview. And then you do the interview. Afterwards, you find out that the documentary is funded by the Koch brothers. Like, oh, wait, that's a Republican operative is funding this. Maybe this isn't going to come out as even-handed as I was hoping. Maybe I'm being used to advance an agenda that I really don't want to be part of. You would say, gee, I wish you had told me that this film is funded by the Koch brothers before I agreed to be in it, correct? So do you think you should have been told this film is funded by Rob Reiner before you agreed to be in it? Wait, don't answer, Skye. Kaitlyn. Kaitlyn, what do you think?
These are not my sins that we're discussing, so...
But you're guilty by association.
Thanks, guys.
You are removed third party, so you don't have skin in the game, so you can tell us if we did it right or we did it wrong. Should I have asked, who is funding this movie? Is it someone who loves Jesus or not? Because if they don't love Jesus, I can't eat your tacos. Taco Bell. I can't associate with non-Christian.
I will say, Phil, I feel really positively that you're asking this question because I watched on Twitter, and my concern with all of this mostly had not been about the most bad faith criticisms. Those are easy to just be like, okay, well, you actually are pro-Christian nationalism, so of course you're upset about this. I worried, though, that some of the legitimate questions about this that are broader than this one specific movie would get lost in it. And some of those questions are what you just described of like, how do the people funding or directing things with other agendas than your own shape them? Some of this is sort of a question that's irrelevant to a lot of Christians. Not a lot of Christians are going to get asked to be in a documentary and like have to figure out, can I work with this person? But I do think on a much more local level, we have to make challenging decisions about who to collaborate with on really local things. Like my church has asked questions about who can we partner with for political work in our city. And there are lines that you would draw, right? There's people you would not work with. So asking that question, I think, is really important. And part of that comes down to, too, like what your vocational sense is. I think a lot of local pastors might look at something like this movie and go, I don't know that this advances my goals for addressing Christian nationalism, which are I have to do slow pastoral work that doesn't kind of heighten for dramatic effect the risk of this thing, which is required to make a captivating movie, but is counter to the goals of pastorally guiding someone in a church who might be tempted by Christian nationalism. So I think that's also something that was happening online too, was people going, well, it wouldn't fit my goals to do this. And I want to really praise those people who say, my goal would not be to kind of make a public stance about this in a pretty explicit way, because the work of being in a relationship with someone in my church and really shepherding them away from that would be counter to this movie. I think that's really important and good. But that's a different question than what people who are not pastoring a church should do.
Yeah. Skye.
Oh gosh, there's so many layers to this. And it depends how abstract you want to get or specific to our experience with this documentary. Kaitlyn, you're making a very valid point that there are pastoral concerns internal to the Christian community about how to combat this heresy that is, infecting more and more people. There is also the concern, the broader witness of the church in the culture. And frankly, I wouldn't say most of my relationships, but a significant number of my core relationships in my life, both family and friends, are people who are completely non-Christian and would never enter, at least in this environment, a church today. And part of my consideration when thinking about participating in this documentary was not what's going to happen to that person who's flirting with Christian nationalism in their local church. It was, what will this do to help non-believers in the culture understand what's going on, and can we collectively, the voices who are all participating in this documentary who are committed to Christ, can we present a different vision of what Christianity is to the culture? And so I didn't hear that question coming up at all in the Twitter controversy. Nobody was saying, hey, it's good that there's Christians who are representing something other than Christian nationalism to the broader culture, to people like Rob Reiner, to Hollywood, to Washington, to my friends and neighbors who don't enter a church. And it's just interesting to me that we are so concerned about our heretical sisters and brothers that we're giving no concern to our completely lost neighbors and friends. And those you can't weigh one more than the other, but there's multiple facets to consider here, not just, will I be offending the person who's saturated in Christian nationalism?
So one line of attack against the participants like myself was, this is a conversation that should be kept in the family. We should discuss this amongst ourselves. We should figure it out amongst ourselves. You're airing our dirty laundry for the public.
Well, maybe you shouldn't crap in your pants. Like, dirty laundry sometimes has to be dealt with aggressively because it's a catastrophic explosion.
I think also the dirty laundry of Christian nationalism is not just visible inside the church.
It's right. It's like a onesie blowout.
Yeah, it was draped across the White House, for heaven's sake. Or the Capitol building. So in my mind, what this does, and the advantage that I have is that I've seen the film. And so I can say it is not, left-wing propaganda trying to paint all evangelical Christians as insane, which is why it features so many evangelical Christians expressing concern. So, dodged a bullet there. Ha 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 ha. It's like if Michael Moore asks you to be in his documentary and you go, oh dear, Michael Moore. Oh boy, where is he going with this one? So I've seen the film. Benefit of hindsight. It's good. It's a good film.
One last thing,
Yes.
just because you and I have seen the film, others who've participated have seen the film. The world has not seen the film yet, and the critics online have not seen the film yet. But it was interesting to me that when all this hit the fan, what was it, Friday or something, nobody was debating the merits or criticizing Christian nationalism. That's not what they were debating. What they were debating is Rob Reiner.
Yeah.
and our connection or lack of connection to Rob Reiner. And it's such a classic. This is one of the things you do to avoid cognitive dissonance. When somebody is confronting you about a strongly held belief, one way to dismiss their critique is to discredit the messenger. And that's what was happening. The whole movie was being discredited because, well, Rob Reiner put money behind it.
That's the genetic fallacy.
Yeah, you can't take any criticism of Christian nationalism seriously because of Rob Reiner.
Right.
And no one's actually dealing with the issue itself. And that just tells me they're trying to defend something that's indefensible.
Okay, what about this, Kaitlyn Chess? The critique is what Rob Reiner and his friends, his progressive friends, really want is for conservative Christians to feel like they should not participate in politics at all. And so if you're religious, you need to step aside and let everyone else decide everything about your country. And all Christian nationalism is simply Christian folks voting their consciences. Consciousnesses.
Phil, this is a great example of why people making comments about this without having seen it is kind of silly, because I don't know. I could totally see a world, as someone who hasn't seen it, where that could happen. And I do, I have to admit, I want to be sympathetic to the people, not the kind of wild, exaggerating people on Twitter, but some of the people on Twitter who worry that, not just that worry that this will describe all Christians engaging politically as bad, but that it is a really challenging thing to define, and that it can make their conversations with people about how to do this more difficult. I think in general, they might be exaggerating the ability of one movie to drastically shape the whole national conversation about something. But I do think this is like a really hard thing when a lot of what we consume about Christian nationalism is confused itself about what we're talking about. And I hope, my best hope for it, again, as someone who hasn't seen it, is that it would provoke conversations amongst Christians about how to better articulate what the concern is. Because I do think we can make errors in multiple directions. We can define it too broadly, and we can define it too narrowly so that it just happens to not include the thing that I, am caught up in. But it's important. And this goes back to I think diagnoses of the problem like Christian nationalism are really important, but the other work that I think a lot of pastors and churches need to be doing, rather than just focusing on criticisms of Christian nationalism, is giving good political theology. Because you can make all the criticisms you want, and that's not the job of a documentary filmmaker. That's the job of pastors and churches, of going, okay, what constructively actually do we believe? You can't just criticize and then give no one anything else to stand on. And that's when they'll end up feeling like, oh, I guess you're just saying I can't engage politically. It's like, well, no, I haven't given you then the tools of this is good Christian political theology of how we should engage in our government. And it's not this other thing that I'm criticizing.
Right. Oh, I wish that were the case, Kaitlyn.
I don't think that this is happening.
I know. And that's part of the problem is I can't think of ever in 48 years almost of some engagement with the church having heard anything within the church that I would consider political theology.
I'm working on it, okay? I'm trying.
I know you are. But in that vacuum, that's where you get these problems. Yeah. That's exactly.
But I do think it's important to say, if you were looking at this, the clip that you saw, the trailer that you saw online, and you're going, that doesn't address the issue in my church, I don't think it's supposed to. It really can't get at what I think fundamentally needs to happen, which is we need a more robust political theology. We need to be able to be teaching that in churches, and we're not doing a very good job of it.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a statement from the film itself. This is from the film's website on what Christian nationalism is. So this is how they're defining it from the viewpoint of the film. Christian nationalism is the belief that America should be defined as a Christian nation with government adherence to this ideology. Okay? So it's not simply Christian nationalism is when Christians try to pass laws that are based in their religious belief. It's it's, and I think this is from Andrew Whitehead, who said Christian nationalism is saying this is a Christian nation and the government should take steps to maintain that character, should be enforced. Okay, speaking of which, does that mean that we should have or not have satanic displays at Christmas time? I don't know if you heard this. Is also blew up. We Americans, we good God-fearing Americans, the Iowa State Capitol currently has a display in it, a Christmas display from our friend Lucian Greaves and the Satanic Temple folks.
Don't say
Yeah,
he's our
what?
friend,
He's our
Phil, 'cause
friend,
people
Lucian
will take you
Greaves.
literally. Between Rob Reiner and
I'm
Lucian
seeing
Greaves,
this
we're
clip on
not.
Twitter now.
Yeah, we've been talking about
Seriously.
Lucian Greaves for a decade, so I feel
Yes,
like
we
we
have.
know him. At least a decade.
What?
So the Satanic Temple applied to be able to put a display up for some reason at the Iowa State Capitol building. Why Iowa? Why now? I don't know. And it's kind of, we talked about the Baphomet. Remember their big goat?
The bath mat.
Yeah, the bath
Yeah.
mat, the big goat man statue, man with the head of a goat. And that's
With
what...
with two young children next
Yeah,
to him.
that's the official statue. That isn't what this is,
Right.
though. This is a crimson cloaked figure with the head of a goat, which originally they proposed it would be an actual head of an actual goat. And the state capitol said, no, we don't do that. We don't do it.
That's a biohazard.
Yeah, that's a biohazard. So they did a sculpture of a goat's head. A Christian who's in the legislature in Iowa wrote to try to explain, I know you're upset, but here's, this is part of being in a pluralistic society. Anyone can petition to have a display. It's up for, I think, 10 days, each one that gets to have a display. This display can do nothing to hurt you. You do not need to be afraid. Some of the same people that are mad at us for being in a movie against Christian nationalism have gone ballistic about this, saying this is exactly the kind of evil that you get when you don't promote America as a Christian country, when you don't have the ability to say Christianity is our religion and it's what we promote because it's good. Okay, so that's the more extreme version of it. Like, what if there were somebody said if the disciples were here, they would go knock down that idol. And someone else said there's not a whole lot of record in the New Testament of them ever doing that.
Yeah, in fact, Paul set up shop right in front of an idol in Athens and decided to use it as a post to preach the gospel
And
to the
then
Athenians.
he knocked it down. But there was after Luke had stopped taking notes. So Andrew T. Walker is an ethicist at one of the SBC seminaries. He wrote a piece that says religious freedom is no blank check for the celebration of evil. And he tries to make a logical, he's a pro-religious freedom guy. He's a Baptist in the classic sense who believes that all people should have religious freedom. Skye's looking at me skeptically, and I'm just going to let that go and pretend I didn't notice. Andrew Walker says, it is within the purview of the natural law for even the non-Christian government official to discern moral excellence from moral evil. A non-Christian could still understand that satanic displays advance moral darkness. Rights exist to protect the ability of individuals to fulfill the moral duties consistent with human flourishing. Rights do not protect moral evil for the sake of moral evil. So that's the first question. Could a secular government declare this display morally evil?
Depending on what it is, yeah.
I mean, yeah, well, not this
Yeah.
display.
It's a guy
I
in
would
a
argue,
it's a
but
guy in a red cloak with a
yeah.
goat head.
A display can be evil. Like if
Yeah.
somebody said, I want to display a monument that, I don't know, commemorates and celebrates the Holocaust, like not in a negative way, like pro-Nazi.
Yeah.
You could say, no, that's celebrating something that is, or if you could have a display that's inherently R-rated or X-rated or, violent, gory, pornographic, whatever,
Like
the government can say
if
no.
he took his cloak off, then you
Right,
could say,
yeah, exactly.
"Oh,
Yeah,
no."
there's decency standards
Sorry.
that we've long established in law.
Okay, so here's Andrew Walker, the SBC ethicist, saying, so if I were on the Supreme Court and a comparable case arose, I would uphold the Constitution and ask the following questions related to relevant facts. And I want you guys to say what you think of this argument. Number one, does the religion being promoted occupy a traditional understanding of what a religion is? Number two.
Yeah, wait, are we reacting to all of these individuals or together?
Okay. So that's a valid question. Does America say we protect religious freedom and we recognize what a religion is?
But he has an additional little comment in parentheses after that statement.
For
Do you
example,
notice that?
is it theist? Does it believe in God? So if it's
Yeah.
atheist, it's not a religion.
Well, you've just ruled out pretty much half of Eastern religions. So Buddhists can't have a monument because they don't believe in God.
Yeah. So that's a.
But it's a religion.
Yeah. Okay.
It's an important question.
Again,
though.
well, yeah, but he is taking a Western
Yeah,
Christian assumption
Yes.
of the definition of religion and imposing it on everyone,
Yes.
which is like basically saying, does Christianity recognize this other thing as a religion or not?
Right.
And if it does, then it's valid. Well, that's a circular
Okay.
argument.
Okay. 2, does the religion have a history and tradition behind it germane to our nation's history and culture? That's kind of an added twist.
This one annoys me.
The beginning part of that is an interesting question relating to the first one of like, yeah, it is
Yeah.
really hard. And there's been cases where they were trying to figure this out. Can one person just decide I
Can
am
one-
a religion
yeah.
and now I
Can you
can
just
get
say
protections for that? But
Jedi is
germane
a
to our
religion?
country's history.
So would he be okay with a Native American group wanting to display a
very good
religious
question.
thing that is animistic or worships nature?
Uh-huh.
Because I would argue Native American religion has
Yeah,
a far
germane.
deeper and longer
Germane.
history in our country
Germane.
than Christianity. Or like Islam has been present in the United States since before 1776,
Mm-hmm.
but it's obviously a very small minority of people. So does that qualify for religion? It's clearly theistic.
So you're telling the court to weigh in a very questionable way, like what is
Yeah, and
germane?
frankly, I would argue Satanism has probably been present in the United States before 1776 as well.
Okay. Number 3. So you're not scoring him very high so far. Number 3, is the religion widespread in its practice within the nation?
This is the winner. This for me is the one that I think shows bad argument on his part.
Okay.
And here's why.
Okay.
The very purpose for the Bill of Rights was to protect the rights of minorities. So take freedom of speech. Speech is easy to protect when everyone agrees with that speech. Speech that needs to be protected is speech from a minority point of view. The point of the First Amendment is to protect those who hold unpopular beliefs and give them the right to speak them. What he's arguing here is if a religion has widespread acceptance in the nation, then it gets to be, then it's okay to, then it can have religious freedom. But if it doesn't have widespread acceptance in the nation, then it doesn't get religious freedom. That's a complete inversion of why the founders wrote the 10 Bill of Rights to begin with.
Isn't it different to say, because he does say very clearly he's not opposed to Satanists practicing their religion. He's not saying the government should break down doors and drag them off to prison. What he's saying is the state should not make a display of their beliefs.
Well, if the state cannot display a minority religious belief,
Yeah.
then a state cannot display a majority religious belief because the state cannot establish any religion. That's the First Amendment. So
Okay,
you can't
okay.
say what's good for one isn't good for the other.
Okay.
Which is why the solution here is just get rid of all these stinking displays in government buildings.
Hey, we hadn't gotten there yet. Number 4, would the reasonable observer understand the religious expression to advance some notion or civic or moral good? So
Lucian Greaves would.
So religions are supposed to advance the good. And would a reasonable observer, that's always fun, a reasonable observer see the goodness in this?
In a pluralistic society, that's really difficult.
Uh-huh.
Because, I mean, we've talked about it over the years. The Satanic Temple, Lucian Greaves' organization, doesn't actually believe in Satan. It's actually in favor of materialism and science
Yes.
and reason, and it pokes fun at religion in general. So the whole point of their displays, where they've put them up around the country, is to point out the ridiculous nature of religion and uphold reason and science. So a reasonable person might look at this display and go, yeah, of course it's reasonable because it's poking fun at religion.
Number 5, would the same reasonable observer judge the display to advance a prurient purpose? Prurient purpose. In other words, is there any redeeming value to the religious display, or is its presence merely to offend for the sake of offense?
I mean, that again comes down to
eye of the beholder.
Yeah, it does. And number 6, does America have a tradition of allowing sacrilegious displays in government buildings? Now, who's to say that?
Yes, it does.
Sacrilegious.
It actually very much does.
Oh, we do? Do we
Yeah.
have sacrilegious displays in our government buildings?
We have racist displays all over this country.
Yeah, but is that sacrilegious?
Yes. Yes,
Religious?
because it's an affront to Christianity.
Oh, clever.
I mean, really, if we allow Confederate monuments all over this country, including in government buildings, which is a direct contradiction to Judeo-Christian values,
Yeah.
then how do you tell somebody who's putting up a monument in
Yeah.
favor of science and reason and making fun of religion that you can't do that?
Okay. Kaitlyn, yes or no?
I do want to say something that you read from his article earlier, I think is important, where he says we do expect, or there is some kind of ability for human governments to discern between good and evil, and that we expect that of them. And I think that's true, right? Obviously, when we make laws, we are discerning between good and evil. What I think is missed here, and what I think needs to be said in response to what's been happening, is that we struggle to discern how to go about doing that well. Even amongst Christians, we struggle to discern between good and evil when it comes to really complicated questions. And one of the ways that we have in our history dealt with this difficulty of discerning between good and evil is in having allowances for a variety of religions to practice freely, in part from Christian convictions of wanting people not to be coerced into Christian faith, but in part because we recognize that it is challenging in a broken and fallen world for broken and fallen people to make right judgments between good and evil, and for us to kind of make really confident pronouncements and then enforce them onto other people when we might be wrong, we have wanted to avoid doing. So I think what's important about all of this is, like, I saw some stuff on Twitter where people basically made it sound like to have a really Christian position on this was to not make a theological judgment about this, that it is evil. I think that's perfectly fine to make a theological judgment that this is evil. And in fact, I think it's really important for you to make that simultaneously, to say, I benefit from, and I want others to benefit from, as Skye has described, a country that protects the rights of religious minorities to practice their religion, while still obeying other laws that protect the life and liberties of other people. And I enjoy that freedom and express that freedom by believing and expressing in various appropriate ways that I think this particular display is evil and an affront to God. And I find myself grieved by that. And all of that can be coherent together. You don't have to pick between those two things. And I have seen people feel like they need to pick between those two things. So I don't find this particularly persuasive, but I also do worry that people in responding to this have missed the part that there is a significant role in our public life for elected officials to make judgments about good and evil. A lot of that history has been shaped by Christian ideas about that in ways that, as Skye was just describing, we should celebrate. There were Christian abolitionists saying we have failed grievously in our judgment about these things. And that's a good thing to celebrate. But you also can express that in appropriate ways that don't kind of put yourself in the position of coercing other people in a way that in our country we have a long history of objecting to.
I think that when you go through these 7 criteria that Walker has outlined here, I don't see a way for anything other than Christianity to pass those 7 tests. And so it's an interesting argument that, hey, I'm all for religious liberty and freedom for everybody, but if you want to display anything in a public space, it can only be Christian. And here's my arguments why. And that just reveals this is not about displaying a cross or a 10 Commandments monument or a nativity scene. This is a wolf pack marking its territory, and it's saying this country and this government belongs to Christians, and no one else gets to put their mark here. And that, I think, that's the antithesis of what the Constitution and the Bill of Rights stands for.
Okay.
And I would rather see a country in which we say, hey, we are way more diverse than we were 150, 200 years ago. And therefore, practice your faith, commune with who you want to commune with, worship how you want to worship, do what you want to do, believe what you want to believe. But in our shared public spaces, we are not going to display, and the government is not going to endorse any of them, period. And let it be.
It seems like the only alternative to this is to have no displays.
Right.
at all. What I don't like about this is that the Satanic Temple isn't a religious group. It's a religious cosplay. They're pretending to be religious to try to get under the skin of religious liberty.
My understanding of reading through what was stated by that was a state senator from Iowa is it's not just for any group in Iowa can put up a display. You don't have to be a religion.
All right.
So
I hear you.
go.
All right, it's a group. And if the display doesn't run afoul of community standards, which would be obscenity standards or violence. Does it provoke violence? Is it obscene?
Right. It's not hate speech.
The only thing you can say is we find it obscene because it offends our Christian sensitivities, and that's where you're doing something very different. Okay, against the loser mentality, last story. A group of Christian authors is encouraging Christians to think like losers.
Which authors would these be, Phil?
Andrew Whitehead, for example, condemns Christian nationalism, which for him means nothing more than the use of civil government to enact traditional Christian values. Christians desire America to adhere to Christian ideals. This is Stephen Peter writing in the American Reformer, which is a small, fairly right-wing publication. So Whitehead pleads to evangelicals to embrace their own marginalization, repent of their desire for power, and welcome new versions of Christianity that uplift the marginalized, except for themselves. Christians should reject the temptation to use civil power and instead consciously refuse to procure earthly power while championing the ideals of modern social justice. Next author. Who's next author? Kaitlyn how do you pronounce that? Kaitlyn Oh, hey, that's you! Is that you?
Are we only talking about this because people were already mean to you, and so now someone has to be mean to me?
The Bible and the Ballot. In her narrative, she criticizes Winthrop's City on a Hill. Everyone knows that was talking about America and why we're a shining city on the hill, as misappropriating the promises of the Israelite covenant. Shess tells her readers that our society is doomed for destruction. Curiously, later on in her book, Shess lifts black Christians who drew upon the Exodus tradition to fuel their struggle for political recognition. Clearly, what the black Christians and MLK did is appropriate. What they did is appropriate the promises and traditions of the Israelite covenant. So black Christians can do it, but white Christians cannot, according to Miss Shess. Evangelicals must wrestle away our, quote, obsession with making the United States follow Christian ideals and instead pursue a Christianity that coincidentally aligns with progressive values. Here's the then he brings in Andrew Stanley in his latest book. So
Andrew?
And Andy Stanley. Sorry, Andy Stanley. Well, his name is Andrew. I'm sure it's on his birth certificate.
I know. It's
I've never
funny.
heard that.
I'm sorry. Evangelical. We must wrestle with our obsession with making the United States more Christian. So a professor, a podcaster, that's what you were
so
called.
Rude.
Oh, how's that make you feel,
so rude.
Kaitlyn? How does that make you feel?
He's knocking you down to our level.
So a professor, a podcaster, and a pastor, all within a year of each other. Coincidence? I don't think so. Parrot, in their own unique way, the same loser mentality. In the face of demographic decline and diminished cultural influence, evangelicals should not seek power, but embrace being second-class citizens in their own country.
I thought that was the most accurate depiction of Kaitlyn's book I've ever heard.
Caitlin? Caitlin?
Okay.
How's it feel, Kaitlyn? How's it? Welcome to my world, Kaitlyn. Welcome to my world.
I have two things to say about this. One.
Yes.
Only two.
Well, the debater in me wants to do a point-by-point refutation of this thing, but I'm restraining myself.
We don't have time for that.
Caitlyn, two things. One, and two things that I want to commend this author for, because they are important things, and some of them are things I agree with. First thing, I think he has actually highlighted an important kind of implicit tension in my book, which is that, yes, there are times in which I designate certain interpretations as kind of incorrectly or inappropriately taking on the identity of Israel and the promises of Israel, and sometimes even the judgments of Israel. And then there's other times where I'm describing Christians going to the Old Testament, the stories of Israel, and appropriating them to understand their own political circumstance. Now, already there's a difference there because
Inconsistent,
one of
Kaitlyn,
those is promises connected to a particular covenant. One of those is a story about God's people and what kind of God is and how God relates to those humans that are his people. But the other...
One is claiming God's character, the other is claiming a specific promise.
But the other really important difference that actually this entire article, I think, really highlights is that part of what I was trying to articulate, and after reading this, I thought, did I never explicitly say that? And I did, is really trying to say part of what we are always doing when it comes to interpreting scripture in our political life is not only interpreting God's word, but God's world and our place in it. And so there are moments in the book where it's like, I appreciate this interpretation because it not only correctly interpreted the story of the Exodus, what does this mean about who God is and how God relates to God's people, but also correctly determining our place in our current social and political moment to see if this is an appropriate application for us. It was appropriate for enslaved Americans to say, I see myself in this story of the enslaved people of God and how God treated them. It was incorrect for Winthrop to say, I was given this land I am landing on, and now I can justify whatever I want to do because God has given me this land. That was not only an incorrect interpretation of Deuteronomy 30, it was an incorrect interpretation of what role he played in the whole redemptive story. And discerning that is a really important question, which goes to the second thing, which is this whole article is saying we have made an incorrect interpretation of where we're at. But the author doesn't really explicitly get into how challenging this question is for us to determine what kind of situation are we in. Are we exiled because of judgment, importantly? Not something we seek out, but because of judgment, we are in exile and have little social or political power and need to respond appropriately. Or are we not? I actually really agree with him when he says, for Christians with a lot of political power currently to claim that identity for themselves is not great. I have real questions about that, actually. I don't think that he is correctly interpreting any of the authors that he talks about in saying that we are saying Christians should purposefully walk into having less ability to shape our communities. What I think most of us are trying to say is when we find ourselves having less kind of cultural sway as Christians, we can't assume that everyone is a Christian and shares our ideals. There might be in that moment an opportunity for us to discern a new way of being that corresponds to what God is calling God's people to do here and now. And the ending of his article, the whole time I was like, I totally agree with you that Christians who are in exile should build flourishing communities and seek to be excellent at what they do. And totally agree with that. I don't know how he interpreted our books in such a way that we would be in opposition to that.
So this statement from him. How can we be losers? The opposite is true. Everything against God's rule is destined for destruction, but we will remain. And our task in the meantime is to let a preview of this abundant life overflow into good works for our neighbor and society. Why are you against
I
that?
love that?
Why are you against that, Kaitlyn?
Love it. I love it.
Not that anyone else needs to defend Kaitlyn because you did an excellent job, but I think part of the misunderstanding here is actually rooted in the title of this piece. Phil, what was it again?
The title of the piece, Against the Loser Mentality.
Okay. We've heard the word loser a lot in the last 8 to 10 years. Donald Trump has really elevated that idea, winning and losing, in our cultural and political lexicon. And when I've read Kaitlyn's book, or talked to her almost weekly, when I've read Whitehead's stuff, and I haven't read Andy Stanley's book, but I think what I hear you guys all saying is we should certainly be engaged. We should contribute to our society, including politically. We should bless. We should persuade. We should serve. We should do all those good things that he talks about. The difference is we're not called to win. We're not called to dominate and suppress others because we should be in charge. And so when he frames it as losing or winning, that's where I think it gets screwy. You guys aren't saying Christians should dominate the culture and suppress everyone who disagrees with us. And he's interpreting that to mean, well, then we shouldn't engage at all. And that's not what you're saying.
And I think it's not just the frame of winning. And he never says this explicitly, but I think it's a more accurate description of what these books are saying is it's not just that we shouldn't win, that we should embrace losing. It's that we shouldn't desire to win at any cost. We should be willing to, quote unquote, lose if that's what happens when you are faithful and the powers and principalities defeat you, which is why I spend so much time in the book talking about the civil rights movement, which in some ways was quite successful in spite of great odds against it. But also what I find so powerful about that, and the reason I think it's one of the most important places for us to look today, is there was this great emphasis on we have to change some things in our world. There is great brokenness. It's directly affecting our communities, especially the most vulnerable among us even, right? Children, women. We need to fight to change something. However, because of Christian faith, this was not true of all civil rights activists, but many of them, because of our Christian faith, there are some options for achieving that success that are off the table. We don't use violence. We don't separate ourselves from our neighbors. We don't, like, there are options that are just not Christian options. And I think the thing this article misses, at least speaking for myself, I'm not opposed to Christians having cultural and political influence to do good things in the world. I'm opposed to them seeking that influence at any cost. And we have seen the disastrous results when we do that.
To that end, it feels like his article was actually more a critique of Rod Dreher.
Yeah,
and
right.
the Benedict option, right? Because his advocacy was Christians should just completely withdraw and go into monastic life, basically, and protect their own families and children and households and stuff. And that's not what any of the people he cited in the article are saying.
A lot of the Christian nationalist guys will say, how could you possibly, as a Christian, still be living in a blue state? How could you be living in a major city?
Yeah.
You need to get your kids, get your wife, get out of there, come to the rural South, and then we can actually live and practice our religion. So there's a whole lot of runaway from I was going to say the battle, but it's living in New York isn't a battle. It's just very different.
Yeah.
But it's saying I'm going to take my toys and go home. And that's the loser mindset, not the one who stays and engages and loves their neighbor and serves those around them and votes their conscience and participates in civic life.
Skye, if we're not in charge, haven't we lost? Especially when it's our country.
That statement was really weird.
It's evangelicals' country.
Yeah, it's
God,
their own
God
country.
gave it to them in the covenant.
The
of
covenant.
The thing. The Winthrop covenant. Okay, we got to wrap it up. So, Kaitlyn, are you okay? Are you okay?
Yeah.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
You're gonna be okay?
I'm really good.
Because this was a broadside. This was a broadside.
Here's the thing, truly,
Yeah.
there are so many things in this article that I really agreed with, and I am thankful to this man for helping me articulate some things that maybe I could have
Good.
articulated more clearly. But also,
See,
I would encourage people to
yes.
read the books that they see criticized online and see if those criticisms are accurate.
See, Skye, that's how you do it. That's how you.
That's why she's here.
You take flack graciously. You say, "I learned a lot from that critique."
I'm being
and I really
truthful.
appreciate it. Yeah, I know you are. I'm just, you're also doing very good modeling for us. Very good modeling. Okay, everybody. We will be back next week. Thanks for your support. Merry upcoming Christmas. Go to holypost.com. You can support us and also get access to a whole lot of additional content on Holy Post Plus. And we will be back next week with much more fun. Thanks, guys. Goodbye. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode.
This episode is being sponsored by AG1 by Athletic Greens. Some of you know that my dad is a doctor, and as I get older, he's always telling me to watch my weight and exercise regularly. But in the last few years, he's also been telling me to pay attention to my gut health. He's been persuaded by all the research saying that the biome of good bacteria that lives in our guts is critical to our long-term health.
There's just one problem. I hate taking lots of pills and vitamins and supplements. And why do they always have to be so big? That's one of the reasons I was excited to try AG1 by Athletic Greens. AG1 is a foundational nutritional drink with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food ingredients. I take it first thing in the morning before I've had my tea and before I jump into my morning routine of writing my daily devotional. And I'll be honest, it tasted way better than I expected. I've been doing it for a few weeks now, and I feel great knowing I'm supporting my health and not having to gag down a bunch of giant pills every morning. And that's why I've stuck with it, because AG1 is a super easy daily habit. So, if you're looking for a simpler and cost-effective supplement routine, check out AG1 by Athletic Greens. And right now, Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/holypost. That's athleticgreens.com/holypost.
It seems like everyone has a painful church story, and if you don't, you certainly know someone who does. Abusive leadership, cover-ups, divisions, scandals, it's causing many people to give up on the church and in some cases on faith altogether. Rather than defending the church or demonizing it, in his new book, Bishop Todd Hunter acknowledges the reality of what he calls bad religion. He talks about the very unique kind of pain that churches inflict, but he also points back to the true aims of Jesus, who he says hates bad religion more than anyone. Bishop Todd Hunter leads Churches for the Sake of Others, a church planting initiative of the Anglican Mission in the Americas. He was formerly the national director at Vineyard Churches USA and then at Alpha USA. His new book is called What Jesus Intended: Finding True Faith in the Rubble of Bad Religion. And in his conversation with Kaitlyn, Hunter offers both wisdom and practical advice for those of us who are suspicious of the church, but still hanging on to Christ.
Todd, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Hey, Kaitlyn, it's great to meet you. I've heard your voice lots of times, and now I get to actually see your face and have a conversation. It's great.
Yeah, it's great. So we're here talking about your book, What Jesus Intended, and I really enjoyed reading the book, and I love the subtitle, Finding True Faith in the Rubble of Bad Religion. What made you want to write a book specifically for people struggling with faith and with church? Yeah. I think part of the reason we've been so interested in this book for the Holy Post is that describes a lot of our audience, people who either have questions like, intellectual faith kind of questions that have really kind of stopped them. But I think more often people who are asking questions about hypocrisy in the church or have had really deep personal experiences with it. So what prompted you to write a book to those people?
Yeah, a couple of different things. I often refer to myself amongst friends as I'm like an amateur sociologist of religion, meaning from a really young age, in my 20s, I've had this curiosity about the intersection of gospel and culture and church, and have read a lot of missiology and sociology and that sort of stuff. But the other thing, Kaitlyn, is I've been a pastor since I was 19, and I'm 67. So that's, do the math. That's 48 years or something I've been doing this, which means, as I say in the book, I've seen the way the sausage is made. And as a pastor for decades, I've seen, people struggle with church. And while most recently I've been a bishop, still through the eyes of my rectors of the churches I supervise, I see and hear their heartache of the people leaving and deconstructing. And it almost always has to do with religion or church or spirituality or something. But you never or rarely hear anything about Jesus. And so as I wrote this book, I just wondered, what if we could conceive of Christian spirituality not through making sense of Jesus through the lens of church experiences, but what if we could reverse it and try to make sense of what would it mean to be the people of God, starting with Jesus?
Yeah, I love that. And I also just want to say, I love at the beginning of the book, you have a moment where you say explicitly something that I don't think I hear acknowledged enough, which is that church pain is a unique kind of pain. Yeah. I have my own story with this, and sometimes I would get frustrated when I was trying to articulate to people either people who didn't have any experience with church, so I don't think they really understood, like, no, this wasn't a job for me. This was my life. This was my community. This was my family. Right. Or even for people in the church who maybe just haven't had a negative experience yet. I just think it can be hard to articulate why this is so uniquely painful and why it's really challenging to figure out how to move forward from it. Yeah. And I think we need a lot more attention to that. Like, what do you tell people after that? What do you tell people, as the subtitle says, in the rubble of this, what's next? And you were just getting to this a moment ago, but why was turning to Jesus, but especially you use this phrase, that's not your phrase, but the aims of Jesus. Right. Why was that the path that felt like the right path for this book?
Yeah, in the book, I'm really trying to gain a fresh hearing for Jesus amongst those who are, cynical or skeptical or hurt or burned out or just done, with church. And I have so much natural empathy. I thought your question was going to go in a little different directions because I confess in the book to having my own sort of de-church time. And I was a professional Christian. And I remained a professional Christian. That's maybe a story for in a minute here. But I have so much empathy for that. And I just thought, is there a way that I can reframe Jesus? And this phrase, as you mentioned, the aims of Jesus, I first heard from Tom Wright like 20 years ago, I think, in his book, Jesus and the Victory of God. And I remember reading it and thinking, aims plural, what the heck is Tom talking about? Like, didn't Jesus just come to die for our sins, period? End of story. And anybody who's listening who's familiar with Tom's work knows what a great gift he's given us in terms of helping us understand that to which Jesus really was conscious and what he did think the Father was doing in and through him. So in a sense, Kaitlyn, I'm trying to represent Jesus to give fresh hope to these people who are maybe losing Jesus because of these church hurts. That, as you said, I say in the book, I think church hurts are highly unique. Yeah. I've never been divorced, but maybe close to divorce, certainly close to a close friend betraying you. Yeah. I've just noticed over these almost 50 years, they're really true deep hurts. It's not a nothing. It's a really big deal, I think.
Yeah, let's go back to what, you were just saying about the kind of like being a professional Christian in relationship to this, because I do think a lot of people listening, we have a lot of pastors, former or current pastors, who listen to the show. And it is something that I think about a lot as someone who has been a professional Christian for not as long as you, but for my entire adult life, truly. Yeah. And spends a lot of time with either, currently I spend a lot of time with seminary students preparing for ministry. And a lot of my peers are kind of early in ministry or maybe early in the kind of leadership that they'll hold for a while. I am curious what you would say for people who are in that kind of position, who have experienced great pain, maybe far in the past, but maybe it still is really fresh too. This was true for me when I started my doctoral program. I was fresh off of like the most painful church experience I'd ever had. And I didn't feel like I had a lot of resources for what do I do now? I feel like some options fell off the table. Like for me, it was like, okay, there's a period of time where I'm not going to jump into a church job. I know that I am not a healthy enough person to do that. But even now, as I've started taking on more teaching at my church, I've had to ask some questions with the pastors and elders that I'm under their authority of like, I think there will be some pitfalls for me. Like there are some ways I have to really figure out how to trust people. I need to see how my teaching is influenced by what I've experienced. So what would you say to those people who I think make up a good amount of our listeners, of people who are like, whether I'm pastoring now or I'm teaching Bible study or something, I might be tiptoeing back into that world, but I want to be cognizant of how my past experience might shape in some positive ways. I might be more sympathetic, but it might also shape in some negative ways my ability to move forward in ministry.
Yeah, where my heart goes with that, Kaitlyn, is something I learned from Dallas Willard, who, thank God, in the latter part of my life was my main mentor, and we were good friends. And I can remember Dallas always saying, Todd, we have to find the goodness of God in our actual life as we presently experience it. That if we somehow marginalize our discipleship to good times or even routine times or something, or, Dallas used to teach that if we don't include our work life, our 9-to-5 life in our discipleship, we're missing something. So Kaitlyn, I don't say this because I'm some especially good person. I'm really not. I'm not any sort of spiritual genius, but somehow I've just always known that I have had to try to make sense of Jesus within what was really real. And in giving myself to him in church pain, or, you would know that there's also occasionally church joys where there's a breakthrough or somebody gets healed from an opioid addiction or, wonderful, crazy, wonderful things happen in ministry. But But I've just always had this instinct, and I think it comes through in the book, where I've just kind of always crawled back, to switch metaphors, like a moth to a flame, to just, I've had this intuitive sense that, man, if I in any way let go of Jesus, like, I could be in trouble. Mm-hmm. And so I think I got through my church confusions and church hurts, and actually I don't go into great detail about them in the book because I just felt like it would be inappropriate. But trust me, I have seen the worst of religion, of all sorts. And I've just always made myself, inch my way back to the goodness, the grace, the beauty of Jesus.
Yeah, I was struck reading your book by how much of it is couched in terms of conversations that you had with people from a variety of different backgrounds, which I think was so helpful because everyone's coming at this from a different place. Like the pain of, being in formal vocational ministry at a church and what things are good and bad about that is very different than I have all these questions because of hypocrisy I'm seeing in the news, or I've never really been a part of a church and I'm kind of cautiously curious, or and I love the way that so much of it is couched in terms of you just listening, like tell me what is hard for you, or what do you have questions about. What do you think we learn from listening to those stories? Because I think we have lots of conversations right now about declining church attendance, declining church affiliation. And sometimes I think we make some pretty big assumptions in a variety of different directions of like what people think or why they're doing that. What was surprising to you, or what do you think we learn from listening to people in that kind of way?
Well, what pops to mind is that it's all over the map. There's lots of reasons. It can be direct hurt, like my nephew was abused by the youth pastor. And then when that happens, the family and the extended family of that person who's abused, you could have 20 or 30 people who spin out. Like it's never just the victim.
Yeah.
Or let's say you find out your dad, who's a pastor or a Christian leader, is the perpetrator. Well, now you got a whole family system of the perpetrator who's spun out. So sometimes it's direct pain like that. Other times it's just good old-fashioned church dysfunction. Sometimes it's just haven't gone to a church where they weren't getting much out of it. So like you said, it's all over the map. And if you're younger, you don't have the default position that, as I said, I'm in my 60s, that boomers had. We had a culture surrounding us, propping us up a little bit. Like I can remember seeing billboards, find a church and join one. Well, it's been decades since I saw billboards like that. So the cultural plausibility structure for the goodness of church is almost completely gone. And for many people, I guess another thing is, and I'm never picking on anybody, I'm not mad at anybody, but the Southern Baptist Convention being in the news, the largest Protestant denomination, the Roman Catholic scandals being in the news for years now, I just think drip by drip, it has eroded the plausibility in many people's minds that the church could actually be good.
Yeah.
Like one more thing, Kaitlyn, like when I was young, and Josh McDowell, you might be too young to remember Evidence That Demands a Verdict, There was an era when I was young in the 70s where just sort of basic apologetics was the thing. And we knew that if people could come to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and or things like the Bible is reliably the word of God, that they would kind of predictably come to faith. Well, now when I talk to young people, it's a whole different set of questions. It's more like, at bottom, at net, is the church on the earth a source of good or a source of evil? Well, that's a very different question than did Jesus rise from the dead?
Yes. I was just talking to someone recently who's, a generation and a half-ish older than me, who was asking about MDiv students at Duke, who's really interested in this historical question of did Jesus rise from the dead? And I was like, honestly, none of them. Most of them, even if they're pretty committed to pursuing ordination and a denomination, are still really kind of wrestling with is this a good way to spend my life? Am I committing myself to something that is good or not?
Yeah.
And I find it interesting then that you have some places in the book where you kind of avoid giving the answer that I've heard some people give, which is, yes, all this bad stuff has happened, but let me give you all the good stories. Let me tell you the things that are really good. And in some ways, I personally have found comfort in some of that. My academic study of the civil rights movement has played a significant role in how I feel about the institutional church.
Yes.
But as you say in the book, what are we doing? Are we just sort of like stacking up pros and cons? Like, how do we go about evaluating? And then I think many of us have the experience of like, sometimes it's not just, oh, this church over here did bad stuff and this church over here did good stuff. It's like, same place, such good stuff and such bad stuff. And I don't really know how to untangle the fact that I met Jesus at this place that other bad stuff happened in, that other people had such negative experiences. So do you think there's some value in some of this conversation about the good and the bad? And if not, like, where do we go? I mean, how do we find in scripture or in the life of Jesus something that responds to the fact that I think most of us are aware that there is good and bad, and some of that doesn't satisfy the experience either that we've had personally of the bad, or the just discomfort we have with like, why is it not better than it looks?
Yeah, you're right. I steadfastly avoid doing that kind of arithmetic in the book because, again, to remind the listeners that I've been supervising pastors and churches for going on 40 years, so I've seen any and everything that can go bad. And the last thing you want to say to a 14-year-old girl whose youth pastor has just sexually harassed her is, oh, don't worry, in most phases of his life, he's a pretty good guy. And remember, just last weekend, he had you all out serving the poor, as if that somehow does some sort of math, it introduces some sort of equation where the two sides cancel each other out. And that's, of course, the malpractice 101. It's the worst thing we could say to somebody like that. But you're right, Kaitlyn, to be fair, like right now, it's 10:15 or 10:16 Central Time. And so if you think of the world clock, it's 11 o'clock in New York and just keep going around the globe, and it's, 8 o'clock on the west coast of America. If there's billions of, what is it, like 2.4, 2.7 billion Christians alive on the earth today, then I would bet everything I have that literally right this moment, there are hundreds of thousands of sincere Christians who we have no idea their names, will never know their names, who are picking up bodies off streets, who are volunteering at hospitals, so there's mounds of acts of kindness being done right this second by Christians. But that can never be, so therefore don't worry about the latest guy we just saw in the newspaper. Right. It just doesn't work that way. But to be intellectually honest, and which maybe is underneath your question, is there is a terrible simultaneity happening. It's maybe not a lot different than theodicy. Maybe it's like applying theodicy to the church or something instead of to God, How is it the church is this institution who does such great good on the earth, but is also the perpetrator of great suffering? And for me to be intellectually honest, I just have to say it's both.
Yeah, I so appreciate that because like you said, I think sometimes what people are looking for is just, are you going to be honest with me about this? Are you going to paint a rosy picture that isn't fair? Another point in the book, because I do want to return to again, the aims of Jesus, which is a striking phrase. And you have a section where you're talking specifically about the parables of the kingdom and how that relates to some of this. Can you talk a little bit about why those parables are significant? Because I do think, as you describe in the book, my understanding as a kid of Jesus's aim, which was pretty singular, was get as many people in the lifeboat out of here as possible. Right. And it is really uncomfortable when you read some of those parables and go, I don't know how some of these directly relate to the just like share the gospel and then pluck us out of here message. But I also don't know that a lot of the people who are cautious or hurt by the church have heard those stories either. Why were those kind of specifically those parables significant for you?
Because they alert us to something that I think is hugely paradigmatic to understanding Jesus, and that is that he was deeply conscious of arising within a story. Like he did not just show up out of the blue. And the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke for sure show this. Jesus saying things like, I've not come to set the law aside, I've come to fulfill it. Well, again, this is not the place for a Bible study, but what is law? What is Torah? It's not like stop signs and pay your taxes. It's God's guidance. It's God's coaching. It's God's mentoring to have a certain people on the earth who would be his agents for good. And Jesus is deeply aware that he's arising within that story. I mean, his first words in public, they're astonishing. The time is fulfilled. Mark 1:14. What is that? Why weren't his first words, you all stink. And I came because you guys are smoking dope and having sex and, blah, 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 right? That caricature of Jesus. Yeah. But he's deeply mindful of something else. The inbreaking of the kingdom, the ruling and reigning of God, the expressed personhood of God. Jesus is deeply aware that's happening in and through his person, that he's embodying it. And I'm quoting here, I think maybe Hunsberger or something, or Les Newbegin, embodying, demonstrating, announcing the kingdom of God. And the way that he announces it and teaches about it is often through these parables.
Yeah.
And so to me, they're windows into that to which Jesus was conscious. And if the suggestion of my book is, let's try to make good churches or make church good through alignment to Jesus, well, that means we have to take him serious. And what he taught was the kingdom of God, almost exclusively.
Yeah, I remember like early in seminary having a wonderful, like truly mentor to me, wonderful professor who was talking about Jesus. And I remember a few people in the class saying something like along these lines of like, well, Jesus shared the gospel with people. And the professor being like, no, go back and look. Like if he's talking about the kingdom of God, that's not the gospel that you think of as just like Jesus died for your sins, believe in him, and that's the end of the story. Like what was he actually talking about?
Right.
How do you think that this big story relates to some of the specific concerns that people have when it comes to deconstructing? Because I think part of what I hear you saying is when you get back to Jesus, you're not just getting back to nice teacher or moral person. There's a whole grand story involved. And I have to admit that I sometimes am worried in the context I'm in now. I've watched some people who, in response to concerns that the church isn't just or the church isn't good, the response has basically been, let's make a version of the church that basically just does good things in the world, that cares about justice, that serves people. And I love the ministries of those churches, and my church partners with other churches that do those kinds of things. But I worry that at the end of the day, that isn't actually as satisfying to people as we think that it is, or we've run out of the resources we need to actually sustain the work that we're doing.
Yeah.
What would you say this kind of larger story really does? How does that really confront these concerns that people have in a way that's different than, okay, well, if the church has been bad, let's do some good things instead?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say you're onto something, and that group of people is growing, and that it increasingly gets into cahoots with kind of a quasi-religious, quasi-secular progressivism that, like you said, is basically like the remnants of what used to be a robustly Jesus-centered religion is now, well, the only thing I really have left in my conscience or my heart is, as you say, to do good or to seek justice. And because that's typically a, air quotes, progressive issue, and progressive in our world means, the kind of the left of our political spectrum. And because I listen to the Holy Post, I've heard a lot of your guys' conversations about Christian nationalism and stuff, and kind of the errors on the right or the far right. Well, I think there's an equal and opposite error in the reference of what we're talking to today on that kind of left side, where there's vestiges of religion, but not much. It's mostly just about doing good. And I don't think there's a there ultimately. Now, doing good, I'm a big fan of doing good. I started something called the Center for Formation, Justice, and Peace, and we're all about trying to do good in the world, but it's rooted in Christian formation. That's why the word formation is in there. Yeah. So the doing good that emerges precisely from the Jesus of Scripture, I'm all down for. But when it starts kind of divorcing itself from Jesus and his commandment to do good, or, Kaitlyn, what about this? If Jesus knew he arose precisely within this narrative that, let's say, begins in Genesis 12 with Abraham, I'm going to make you into this great nation, and you're going to bless the whole world. Thinking again, Tom Wright sometimes calls it that the Jews were becoming God's cosmic first responders to heal the earth. And then if you think of one of the very last scriptures in the Bible, Revelation 22:5, that says that we, the church, will rule and reign with him forever and ever in the new heavens and the new earth. So if you think of like the creation covenant, do good, Abraham, do good, all the prophets calling for doing good, and then we see that we're actually going to be God's cooperative friends forever and ever in the new heavens and the new earth, well, then that provides the story from which precisely the church does good. Yeah. Like we don't do our good from leftist politics, or we don't do our good from, in my view, from Marxist or communist things. I know we have a mutual friend in Esau McCauley, and one of the funniest things Esau ever said to me was, "Hey, Todd, we black people didn't need 20th century theorists to tell us we were oppressed. Like, we didn't need Mark to say, hey, you guys realize you're oppressed?" So there's this whole big story of what it means to be the people of God, and with Jesus as the head of that people, and if from that story we can find our way to being actually agents of good on the earth and healing and repair and anti-racism and all the things we care about, man, then there's a there. But you see what I'm saying? When you get to just the shadow of religion and you marry that to sort of progressive ideology, I don't think there's a there.
Yeah, I tell people all the time, there's kind of a bunch of more progressive churches in my city. That's a city that's more progressive. And a lot of them will try and attract like Duke students, undergrads, with big signs or big presentations that will say like, look, we are doing the justice thing. Like, we're on the right side of these questions. Don't worry that our church is kind of stodgy and conservative, like come for these reasons. And honestly, it's usually the more conservative churches that are attracting college students. And I don't think it's just because conservative politics or theology. Right. I really think part of it is who actually is offering something different, is telling a different story. If they're just interested in fighting for justice, there's a bunch of campus groups they can join that will do that. I think they're attracted to churches that are like, we actually believe Jesus Christ rose from the dead and that changes everything.
Yeah.
And that I worry that some of us that are trying to respond to the deconstruction question and the church abuse question are forgetting that we have some of these great resources. And one of those that worries me too, that you talk about in the book, I was encouraged by, is the way in which we have to ask this question about bad religion of ourselves as well. Like I said before, I feel like I spend a lot of my time thinking about my kind of cohort of people who are just starting in leadership in churches and Christian institutions. And one of my concerns is that we focus so much on the failures and problems of prior generations that we're not paying enough attention to, like, well, what's kind of systematically happening in us that might be different than that, or might be the replication of that, but we're so hyper-focused on these other issues that deserve attention, but we're not thinking enough about, like, where is this happening in us?
Yeah.
How does the story of Jesus, the aims of Jesus, what we find in Scripture about what Jesus said and did, how does that help us think about how we evaluate bad religion in ourselves, how we don't forget to have that kind of internal question as well?
Yeah, so first diagnosis and then maybe get at a bit of a prescription. So I know exactly what you're saying. I have an alert I put on my phone. I've never done this before either, but when the war broke out in Kiev, are we 2 years now or close to 2 years?
Yeah.
I put an alert on my phone to pray for the war there every day. And now when that pops up, I also pray for Gaza and Israel. So it's one thing for me to pray, as I did this morning, something like, God, please stop the hatred that leads to the bloodshed. Well, to be a real follower of Jesus, Kaitlyn, as you're saying, I have to pray for my own heart too. God, stop the hatred in my heart. Because if there was an ethical, spiritual, psychological, social genius of Jesus, and I think there was, I think Jesus has the best information possible on what it means to be human in the image of God. It was what I talk about in my book, his genius about the centrality of the heart. That it's not things external to us. My youth pastor molested somebody. Some famous person who's in the news did something. Yeah, that's true. It's real. And we never want to be in the position of denying reality. But what about the parts of my heart that lust or want to fabricate the truth because I feel fearful or something?
Yeah.
And so, Jesus said it's not these things external to us that are happening in Kiev or Gaza or whatever that defile us. It's the things from within our heart that defile us. And I think if there's a path back to an intuitively held good sense of religion, it would be from millions of people who are truly repenting as Jesus asked for, because we've taken him serious about, if they do this in AA, how much more us, like a ruthless, fearless moral inventory. Because that term in the New Testament, metanoia, for repentance, it means something like rethink everything. If Jesus is right and the kingdom of God is now present among you, Jesus said, repent and believe. So repent, rethink everything now if this is true, and then believe, place your confidence in it. And I think if suddenly millions of people were taking Jesus serious about heart religion, then Jesus knows that turns into a public good.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And it it relates to kind of the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is partially, you know, we need these resources for in the wake of the question or in the wake of the church pain.
Yeah.
But then I think we also need, and the book does this multiple times too, is kind of say, okay, let's imagine now you have been deeply captivated by the aims of Jesus, the story of the person of Jesus. You're in relationship. And now you're either, you know, considering a church or you're a part of a church, and you're wondering, how does that internal change manifest in this community? How do I be a faithful participant? How do I discern when something wrong might be happening here too, in this new place? But also, what does it look like for me? Yeah, we get asked this question a lot in the Holy Post, like, how do I find a church?
Yeah.
And that's an interesting question. And I think sometimes we can answer it in sort of consumeristic ways that are not good. But I think the better question is like, how do I be a good participant? How do I be a part of a community in a faithful way, especially if I have some questions about the hypocrisy of the church, or I have this past experience, or... So how would you counsel those people? Maybe people who are like, I'm new and kind of hanging out in a church, or I am kind of looking down the street in my neighborhood and going, should I darken the door of that place? How would you counsel them, thinking through what you were just saying about kind of this is internal work, but then it also has these kind of external results, not just in this kind of service that I do, but in the community that I'm a part of?
Yeah. So a couple things. First, attitudinal, then maybe something practical. I think it was my second book I wrote for InterVarsity. It's called Giving Church Another Chance. And I dedicate it to Dallas Willard, Richard Foster, and Eugene Peterson, that cluster of people who are kind of mentors in my life. I served on Richard's board of Renovari for many years. And I dedicate it to them because they all three just showed up to church every week, to these totally indescript churches that nobody had ever heard of. They just showed up and practiced. For Eugene, Presbyterian. For Dallas and Jane, they went to a vineyard in L.A., and I forget, Richard was probably going to a Quaker church or something in Colorado. And I just was fascinating to me that these famous men just showed up. And Eugene was famous for saying, I'm paraphrasing here, that church is not supposed to be good. Just find the church closest to your home and walk to it. You know, that was Eugene's thing. Now, I don't know how much of that was tongue in cheek, but he was trying to say something about, to your point, Kaitlyn, don't turn this into merely a consumeristic exercise. The church is always going to be full of broken and being healed people. And one of the points I make in the book is the thing that we're all pained with in 2023 was real with Jesus's first people. I mean, can you imagine the disciples and other onlookers who heard Peter deny Jesus? You could hear people going, oh yeah, I knew those guys weren't real. I mean, you could have teed off on Jesus's first friends. Or James and John wanting to call down fire from cities in Samaria. You can just hear people going, those Christians can't be trusted with power, I'll tell you that. Or people knowing, sort of manipulative things are in Judas's heart. So I often jokingly say that a first third of Jesus's first posse didn't have it all together. So the church is, because you're a scholar, that we wouldn't have much of the New Testament if it weren't for the problems that Paul was having with churches. So it doesn't really help us. It's maybe just sort of tongue in cheek. But practically speaking, again, so if you think of Foster, Willard, Peterson, and you think of like 80s, 90s, that sort of thing, they weren't facing what we're facing. But what they were facing was really poor levels of discipleship. So let's just make that kind of similar. And I would say maybe what if it's not picking a church? What if it's maybe more like if you're doing a PhD, you're trying to pick a mentor before you're picking an institution. Like, who wants to think about this topic with me? Who's already thinking about it? Maybe has 2 or 3 colleagues around her. And maybe that's where I want to go, but because of the person, not because of the brand of the name of the school. So what if it was something like, I just need to find 5 or 6 or 12 people who I can trust to have this conversation with me. And if they're in XYZ church, great. Or we all find a church together. I'm wondering if it doesn't start with just kind of a small group of people who you can share your church hurts, but in a constructing way. Well, deconstruct within a kind of an overall constructive, where you're held by something, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You're not just free-floating in a deconstruction that doesn't have any aim to it. So I'm wondering if it's not more, hey, how do I find a small group of people? And then we're churched together.
Yeah, I love that. I remember I had a good friend of mine who just showed up at a former church of mine because she had heard the Eugene Peterson advice of just like walk and then find a church. And it is, I mean, you're always picking the hard thing. Like there's just going to be a different hard thing in lots of places. One of the things, and one additional thing that I loved in the book that I think would make a good last kind of word from you is I loved the part where you said, nobody hates bad religion more than Jesus. And it reminded me, one of the most comforting things in my story with this was realizing I, moved to Durham and I joined a church that's a Presbyterian church, more liturgical of a church than I had ever been in my life. And we take communion every week, which was new to me. And realizing that every single week, my pastor said the words on the night he was betrayed.
Right.
And it just changed. It changed communion for me. It changed church for me to realize that every single week, even if it was really hard, I could get to a point in the service where I would be reminded that Jesus understood being betrayed by the people of God more than I even did.
Right.
So talk to us about this line that Jesus hates bad religion. I think it's important for people, because Jesus gets so caught up in our experience of this, for us to hear how much that matters to Jesus, I think is really important. So can you say more about what you meant by nobody hates bad religion more than Jesus?
Well, Jesus is, again, deeply aware that he's a person of renovation. He's a person of repair. He's a person of repentance. And he's aware that the Jews of his day were misunderstanding God in all kinds of ways. And I think you're referring to the part of the book where I walk people through the woes of Matthew 23, where Jesus says, woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. The other thing is, I think of that phrase that Jesus said a couple times in the synoptics of, to those who have ears to hear. Well, what does that mean? Jesus couldn't have meant who has cartilage and flesh on the side of their head. He couldn't have meant that. Now, if you think of that little word too, and how it's instrumental in its effect, what Jesus knows is that most people didn't have ears to hear him. They had ears, I think Dallas used to say this, to filter and manage him according to their present worldview and perspectives. So the Herodians, they had no ears to hear him. They were trying to fit him into a Herodian worldview. The Zealots, no way, they didn't have ears to hear him. They were trying to make him a zealot. Or the Qumran, the Quietists, the Pietists, of Jesus's day. They were going to go live in caves. Well, okay, fine, but then how are you going to be an agent of healing and repair if you're going to go live in a cave? If you're going to be a part of the Zealots, how are you going to fill your heart simultaneously with hate for Romans and be an agent of healing? Genesis 12:3. So Jesus knew that we all have this tendency to filter and manage him through Republican or Libertarian or Democratic or Presbyterian or Anglican, since that happens to be you and I, through these filters we have. And I think if we can find our way back to what was actually on Jesus's heart, we will actually see that he was put it this way, for the Christian church, he was the first and biggest and best actor against bad religion.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much, Todd. I really feel like that was one of the most moving moments for me. And I think it really speaks to what a lot of people are going through. So thank you for writing this book. Thank you for offering some hope and some wisdom for people who might be just like on the edge of this whole thing and asking some good questions. So thank you for the gift of your wisdom to us.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. Great to meet you.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Mike Strelo. Editing by Area Code Audio. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.